What's it? Tzadi Hey Amid Base. Right, we're on Tzadi Hey Amid Base, 95b, and we're in the midst of the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah, who said that just as when Carbon Pesach is being brought, when is a communal tumah, and so therefore, even though that the community, the bringers of the carbon are tamei meis, have come into contact with the dead, and maybe the carbon, the Pesach itself is now tamei from that, but a zav and these emissions that come from the body that make a person tamei would be exempt and not allowed to bring the carbon Pesach. Rabbi Eliezer added that, and the Mishnah said, however, if they did eat from the carbon Pesach, they would not be kares, even though generally we say somebody who has a tumah of their own body on themselves, that they would, and then they eat a carbon, that there is kares, their soul is cut off from its source. Not so for this carbon Pesach, because in any case, everybody else is tummy. The Rabbi Eliezer extends it that even if not only if they ate of the carbon, but even if they walked in the carbon into the Beis Hamikdash as well. By Rav Yosef, and this is about 7 lines from the bottom of Tzadi Hey Amud Beis 95b. Rav Yosef asks a question: Dachaku tamei mesim v'nichnasu laheichel. What happens? Not in our Mishnah was talking about someone who was not supposed to eat of the carbon Pesach, who ate of the carbon Pesach, or moved into the area he wasn't supposed to go. What about someone who is allowed to eat of the carbon Pesach because it's a communal tumah, and they are tamei by coming to contact with the dead, with the tamei meis, and however they didn't only eat of the carbon Pesach, but they even walked into an area that they're not supposed to walk into. So now they're allowed to walk into part of the Zara, the courtyard, because they have to bring their carbon Pesach, even though that they have come into contact with the dead. They're a tamei meis, but they have to bring a carbon Pesach because it's a communal tumah, and they are allowed to bring the come into the courtyard in order to bring the carbon, but they're not allowed to go into the Beis Hamikdash proper. But they did. What would be the case over there? Now, what's the halach? Do we say, since the courtyard normally is not, one is not allowed to go into if they're tamei, yet over here they're allowed to. So too, if they are tamei, if they went into the Beis Hamikdash proper, the heichel also, even though normally they're not allowed to, in such a case, that would be okay. Or do we say no? The area necessary was permitted, and that which was not permitted is not permitted. Amar Rava Amakras. Rava says in this version from the pasuk, "Vayishluchu min hamachane," it says, "And you will send from the camp." Now, the simple reading is you will send the person out that's tamei from the camp. However, you can also, when you say from the camp, it's sort of the camp, parts of the camp, but not all of the camp. Afilu miktzas machane, meaning even if part of the camp that normally would be prohibited is permitted now, you're still going to keep them out from part of the camp, even a part of the camp. And some say that Rava said it the other way around. You send them from the camp, the entirety of the camp, to outside the camp. To shalchum outside of the camp, you have to send them. So only if you're sending them completely out michutz lamachane, outside of the camp, to shalchum that's when you say you have to send them out of the camp. But if you're not sending them out of the entirety of the camp, because in this case they're in the courtyard, so then the fact that they went into the Beis Hamikdash proper, they shouldn't. If they did, it would not be a transgression. By Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef asked the question. Now, every carbon Pesach has parts that go onto the Mizbeach. Those are not meant to be eaten by the participants of the carbon Pesach. Certain parts are eaten, and certain parts go on the Mizbeach. Those are called emurim. The parts that go on the Mizbeach. The tamei meis, who is not, since it's a communal tumah, this tamei meis, someone who came into contact with the dead, is going to eat of the carbon Pesach. But this person went ahead and ate parts that are supposed to go on the mizbeach, which are never meant to be eaten. And for that, perhaps you could say there's no permission for a tamei mei, somebody that's tamei, to eat that. Yes, it's true that in this particular case, Tuma Hutra Betzibur or Dechuya Betzibur, that the communal Tuma allows for you to bring the Korban Pesach and to eat the Korban Pesach, but only the parts that you're allowed to eat. But when you go ahead and you eat the part that you're not supposed to eat, that is supposed to go on the Mizbeach, perhaps in this case, there is the transgression of eating Betuma, because after all, he's not allowed to eat that part, so there was never a permission for that. So now at the top of Tzadi Vav Amid Aleph, Mahu. What do we say? Midday ishtri tumas basar ishtri nami tumas imurim. Do we say since the eating the Korban Pesach, even though that he is tamei, is permissible, is permitted, so to the parts that he's not allowed to eat, he will not have transgressed if he eats it? Or do we say no? What was permitted is permitted, and what's not, and therefore he transgressed this severe transgression of eating a korban while tamei. Amar Rava Mechti. So Rava said, let's analyze. Tumas emure meheches rab. Where do we know the prohibition that of eating parts that go on the mizbeach, from the parts that go on the mizbeach, that there's a prohibition to eat while in tuma, that the person would transgress and be punished with kares, his soul being cut off from its source. We learn it from, but that prohibition is actually learned from the tuma, the prohibition of eating meat while tamei. The Chsifra, it says in pasuk that if anybody were to eat meat of a korban while he himself has a tuma upon himself, that person will be cut off from its soul. And there it says any parts, if he were to eat of a korban asher lashem, if we will eat of a korban that which is to Hashem. Now, that the wording, it should just say of a korban or a korban Hashem. Why is it say asher lashem? To tell you, l'rabbe sesemurim, even the parts that go to Hashem, meaning they go onto the altar, the mizbeach, they're not meant to be eaten at all. So, since we learn it from the same concept, it's in the same pasuk, the prohibition of eating a korban while tamei, and the parts that go to mizbeach while tamei. So the isay l'tumas basa isay l'tumas harumin. So they can only apply where both apply. Kollel the leisa l'tumas basa. But if there's no prohibition of eating the meat of the korban while tamei, as in this case where the korban pesach is brought when even though that the people are tamei, because the majority of the community is tamei, so leisa l'tumas hamur. So also the prohibition or the severity, the prohibition of eating the parts that go on the mizbeach while the person himself is tamei would also not apply to kares, to the severe punishment of the soul being cut off from its source. By Rabbi Zera, Emure Pesach Mitzrayim Hechak Turin. Now Rabbi Zera wondered, wait, now that you mentioned that there were parts of the Korban Pesach that had to go on the altar, how did they do that in Mitzrayim? They brought a Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim. What did they do with those parts that go on the altar? They didn't have an altar there. They didn't have a mizbeach. Who tells you that they didn't make a kebab out of it? Who tells you they didn't just put it on a skewer and put it in the fire and eat it? In other words, who told you that it needed to go on the mizbeach? It was at that point there was no altar, as your question understands, and therefore it was simply to be eaten as a part of the korban. By a Tana of Yesi, and indeed there's a teaching, a brisa of Rabbi Yesi. Give him his Beichas Hayasham. There were 3 altars, as it were, at the in Mitzrayim. What were the 3 altars? Mashkov, the lintel of the doorway, and Shtei Mezuzos, and the 2 doorposts. The Sumi Hava, but there was nothing else, and that altar was only meant for the putting of the blood on it, with the dipping of the hyssop, I think they call it, into the blood and putting it on the doorposts. So there was no part that was actually burnt on the altar, and so there was no such thing. Now the Gemara, the Mishnah now is going to go into the distinctions that were between Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach L'Doros, the Korban Pesach that was brought in Mitzrayim versus the rules that we have for Pesach for generations. And I believe Michael asked about this a few days ago. And here we're going to see that in general, the Torah says that you shall do to this, and you will do this service as what you're doing in Mitzrayim. You will do this, you will do this annually for generations on this day. And all of Klal Yisrael will bring the Korban Pesach. So in general, we're going to say whatever applied to Mitzrayim applied here as well. However, there are a few things that it says a distinction that this month or this specifically applies to Pesach Mitzrayim. But in general, we're going to say that whatever is done, it was done in Mitzrayim, is done here as well. So Ma bein Pesach Mitzrayim, Pesach Ados. So what distinctions are there between what was done for the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim to versus over here? Pesach Mitzrayim Mekre Ba'aser. You have to purchase the Korban Pesach on the 10th of Nisan in Mitzrayim. You have to purchase it 4 days earlier and check it. It wasn't sufficient to just check it for 4 days. You had to actually purchase the lamb 4 days earlier. And with the bundle, as I mentioned, I think it's called hyssop, with this grass or growth, whatever it is, this twine, this branch of azov, a bundle of azov. You would use that to spritz the blood on the doorposts. That was only Mitzrayim. On the doorposts and the lintel. And also it had to be eaten quickly, which is not the case for generations. Balayla echad, and it had to be eaten that night, and that's true really for other. We'll see in the Gemara in the end. The Gemara is like that's true for all Korban Pesachs, and Pesach Adar is Kol Shiva, and the Korban Pesach for generations it applies for all 7 days. And the Gemara is say, well, what does that mean? There's no Korban Pesach all 7 days. The Gemara is going to explain that means the prohibition of chametz applies all 7 days, or the eating a matzah. Okay, Manola. So how do we know that there's this distinction? The Chsifra, it says Dabro al kol adas Yisrael. It says speak to all bnei Yisrael leimar ba'asor lachodesh hazeh. It is on the 10th of this month, vayikhu, and they will take for themselves a lamb. Now the fact that it says ba'asor lachodesh hazeh, only in this one you have to purchase it already on the 10th. But for generations, you do not have to purchase the lamb already on the 10th day. Elamiata, so we say, okay, if you're going to make that distinction, well, what do we mean? What is the meaning? It says, and you will keep this lamb, and you will check it for the 4 days. Lemishmeres, meaning to guard it, meaning to check it and see that it doesn't have a blemish, and hold on to it and protect it for the 4 days until the 14th. So would you say that so too this one requires checking for 4 days before shechting it? We are on Tzadi Vav Amid Aleph 96a, the first wide line. And we're discussing the distinctions between the Korban Pesach that was in Mitzrayim and the Korban Pesach that was that's for every generation. And the Mishnah said, one, in Mitzrayim, they would have to purchase it on the 10th day of Nisan and guard it and protect it for 4 days to make sure it doesn't have a blemish. And the pasuk says that you will purchase it on the 10th of this month, meaning this month only Mitzrayim, but not in the future. But what about the fact that it says you will keep it for 4 days? And that's not only for that year, that's for the future as well. And because if you're going to save it in Achar Toim Bikr, if you can tell me you don't have to keep it and protect and check it to make sure that there's no blemish for the 4 days prior. Wait, Vatani, we learn that you do have to check. We learn from the checking of the Korban Pesach in Egypt, in Mitzrayim, that you had to check it for 4 days. We learned that in regards to the daily korban, the lamb of every single day's morning and afternoon service. Vatani, we learned Ben Bagbag said, how do we know that the lamb that's brought for the daily korban, for the Talmud, that you do have to check it 4 days, just like Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim? It says, Tishmaru, you will guard it to bring it close to me in its proper time. And that guarding is the same term we have for Korban Pesach, and we learn, and we learn that the guarding of the lamb and keeping it protected for the until the 14th, from the 10th to the 14th, to make sure there's no blemish. Just as over there by the Korban Pesach, it requires a 4-day examination to make sure that it is without a blemish. Before you could shecht it, so too with the daily korban, as we learned earlier, that there was a section of the Beis Hamikdash in the upper floor where they had a chamber full of lambs, and they would check it there, and that's where they always had a supply of lambs that were checked for 4 days. You're right. The checking part is something that we're going to learn from the Pesach and Mitzrayim, but that's because the Torah says again elsewhere, you will guard it. So we're going to learn from there that it needs the same kind of 4-day guarding as Korban Pesach and Mitzrayim. But the idea of purchasing it on the 10th day, 4 days beforehand, for a Korban Pesach, that is only Mitzrayim, and you don't have to have that. You don't have to have that in Pesach for the future. You can purchase it on the day, really in the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, essentially, on the Temple Mount, on the Har HaBayis. They would buy the lamb and bring it in as a Korban Pesach. So Gemara says, well, for the Korban Pesach of the future, it says in regards to the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim, and this same service shall you do for generations. That all of the services that you're doing now here in Mitzrayim, you shall do every year. So the Gemara says you're right. And as we'll see in the various mitzvahs that it says in Korban Pesach, we're going to say this idea that all of the services, all of the avodah that you're going to do for the Korban Pesach and Mitzrayim does apply for the future. But it says, there is Lemute Pesach Sheni, the Chavasei. That the limit is to the Korban Pesach, that the Korban Pesach did not of the second Pesach did not require a 4-day check. So the first Korban Pesach does require checking it for 4 days. The Korban Pesach of Pesach Sheni, for somebody who's bringing the makeup date on the 14th of Iyar, does not have to check it for 4 days. And I said, wait, if you tell me that from the fact that it says by purchasing the lamb on the 10th day, that since it said in this month, you only have to do it in Mitzrayim and not for future generations, is that true also for eating the Korban Pesach? Because it says, and you'll eat the Korban Pesach b'layla hazeh on this night, maybe only in Mitzrayim, this night in Mitzrayim. Would we say that the lambs in the future Pesachs do not have to be eaten at night? Of course not. That's when you have to eat it. It says you have to do this service for that you're going to do now this year in Mitzrayim. You're going to do that in the future as well. So why does it say you will eat it on this night? This is for the teaching of Rabbi Tzvi Fischer and Rabbi Akiva. We will see that there's a machlekes, and we've seen it already briefly. There's a machlekes between Rabbi Tzvi Fischer and Rabbi Akiva. What's the limit of eating the Korban Pesach? Rabbi Tzvi Fischer says that you can only eat the Korban Pesach until midnight on the night of the Seder. You have to have completed eating the Korban Pesach by midnight. And the basis for that is because it says you will eat it on this night. And it says in regards to the plague of the firstborn, that Hashem will pass through Mitzrayim ba'layla hazeh. on this night, just as over there by the Laila Hazeh of the firstborn plague happened at midnight. So too, when it says you will eat the meat by Laila Hazeh, it's by midnight. That's what Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says. The teaching of Balayla Hazeh this night. That's the comparison to this night, meaning at what time in the night. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, you actually eat the Korban Pesach till the morning, as that's the time that you were going to go out of Mitzrayim. So that's the time that you will eat the Korban Pesach. This is a Gemara we saw in Brachos. So rather, he learns that the teaching of Balayla Hazeh is. He says that the Laila Hazeh means that the Korban Pesach can only be eaten this night and not the second night of Pesach as well. Since it's in the category of Shlomim, I may have thought you can eat it for 2 nights and a day, just like a Shlomim can usually be eaten for 3 half-day periods. So to here, you can eat it for night, day, and night. And Laila Hazeh tells you only this night and not a future night. Elamayata. The Gemara says, okay, so based on what you're teaching, that the Korban Pesach can only be brought, the Korban Pesach only needs to be purchased on the 10th in Mitzrayim, because it says Hazeh this night. What about this teaching? It says in regards to the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim, anybody uncircumcised lo yochal bay, may not eat of the Korban Pesach. Maybe it means only the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim. In Mitzrayim is not allowed to eat, but somebody uncircumcised that didn't have a bris is allowed to eat of a Korban Pesach in the future? No, that's not true. It says you will do this service for generations, meaning the way you do the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim, also for the future. So So if so then why does it say by someone who has not had a bris, they cannot eat the Korban Pesach? Why say in it? To tell you only the Korban Pesach, but someone who did not have a bris, it can still and is still obligated in eating matzah and maror. There are other mitzvahs of the night. They can't eat the Korban Pesach, but they are obligated in eating all in doing the other mitzvahs of the night. Okay, so what about this teaching? Elamiata. If you're right that there is a distinction between the Korban Pesach and Mitzrayim, which needs to be purchased on the 10th, because it says Hazeh, and not in the future generations. What about this halacha? It says Benechar leYochabay, and someone who converted to another religion, somebody who's a foreigner to Hashem, may not eat of the Korban Pesach. Would you say that it means only the Pesach and Mitzrayim, but in the future generations, they're allowed to eat of the Korban Pesach? Of course not. As the pasuk says, that Torah says, you will do this service the way you did it in Mitzrayim, you will do it in the future. So why does it say boy? What is the limit in this? Ibn Echar may not eat. In this, a switching of religion, meaning somebody who gives up on their Judaism may not eat the Korban Pesach. But that would not prohibit someone from eating teruma, even if they gave up on their Judaism. And we need to say this in regards to someone who is uncircumcised, as well as somebody who has left their Judaism. Perhaps I would say someone that doesn't have a bris, that's a certain disgrace to being Jewish. But somebody who left their Judaism, converted out, that's not as disgusting. Perhaps he's not exempt of, not prohibited from eating the Korban Pesach in the future. Tzrichas, I need a separately teaching. Or the other way around, someone who converted out, his heart's not with Hashem. But someone who's uncircumcised that didn't have a bris, his heart's still with Hashem. He didn't do this mitzvah, maybe because of a family issue where others had his siblings that died during a bris, and therefore he's afraid that maybe he won't survive the bris. So maybe that's why he could eat the Korban Pesach. That's why I need a teaching in each one. You cannot eat the Korban Pesach even in the future, but with other things that is permissible. Elamiyat. Well, if you're right that Korban Pesach in the future does not need to be purchased on the 10th, like the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim, on account of that by Mitzrayim, it says you will purchase it on the 10th of this month only here in Mitzrayim. What about this halacha? We know the Torah tells us that if you have a non-Jew living in Eretz Yisrael who accepted upon themselves not to do idolatry, they are considered a ger toshav, a foreigner who is an inhabitant, a citizen of the land, and we are responsible to take care of their well-being. That we have to make sure that they can live with us, and that if they're poor, we take care of them. And as we saw earlier, if somebody has a nevela, an animal that wasn't shechted properly, that you would gift it to them to take care of them. So perhaps they are included enough that they are a toshav, or even a sachir, even someone who is still an idolater, that they would be able to partake in the Korban Pesach, because it says in regards to the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim. Now, Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim, even though there really wasn't a Toshav Asachar, that wouldn't apply until you get to Eretz Yisrael, but it says it over there. And if you're right that Toshav Asachar, that when it said in it, or in this, it means only Mitzrayim in regards to the checking at the 10th, on the purchasing the lamb on the 10th, only in Mitzrayim and not in future years. So why don't we say the same thing, that the Toshav and Sachir are not allowed to eat of the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim, because it says in it, only in Mitzrayim, and elsewhere not. Of course, that doesn't really make sense, because there was no Toshav and Sachir in Mitzrayim. But nevertheless, the Gemara is saying, based on your limiting, your extrapolation from the limiting word hazeh, this one. So too here it says this one. But he would eat in the future. No, so that's what we said. No, it says clearly in the Torah that you will do this service of the Korban Pesach that you're doing here in Mitzrayim, you will do it in the future. And these halachas apply obviously for the future years. So what limiting factor is there that it says in this and not on something else? To tell you this idea as well, as we saw before, that somebody who is a toshav, a sachir, somebody is not included in Bnei Yisrael, is going to be excluded of Korban Pesach, but not excluded of Teruma. What about this teaching? Now Rashi has a lengthy Rashi. He's bothered by why would we think that a toshav and sachir could eat teruma, but we'll go with the text that we have, and that this is the exclusion. Elamiyat. If this is the case, that you're right, that when it says in this, it means only the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim, even though we've already answered about 5-6 of them that it doesn't mean only in Mitzrayim. But if you're right that the purchasing of the lamb on the 10th is only true in Mitzrayim because of the limiting text that says in this month, well, what about this? Umalta isay az yochabay. The halacha is that not only the person himself has to have had a bris, but his children or all those that are dependents in the household would also have had to have a bris, and if they have not, he may not do the Korban Pesach. Amalta isay, and it says your son, you will do a bris for him, and then you can eat of the Korban Pesach, and if not, you cannot partake of the Korban Pesach. Is that limit? Is that halacha only in Mitzrayim or even in the future? But in the future, he's allowed to eat the Korban Pesach even though he has members of the household that didn't have a bris. Well, it says you will do this service in the future generations, like in Mitzrayim. So too, one would be excluded from the Korban Pesach if they have a household member that didn't have a bris. So why did it say in it? That the members of his household have to have a bris in a Korban Pesach. That would be limiting. But he's allowed to eat truma if he's a kohen and his household members did not have a bris. Elamiyata. Well, what about this one? It says, but you'll not break the bone of the Korban Pesach. Now, in it only in Mitzrayim, or is it apply even in future? Would you say the same limit that in Korban Pesach and Mitzrayim you can't break the bones, but in the future you may? It says you will do this service for the future. All right, the service that you're doing now here in Mitzrayim, you're going to do in all generations. So why does it say to tell you only in a kosher korban may you not break the bones, but once it's an invalidated korban, you're allowed to break the bones. Well, what about this one? Is it the chsifra? It says no. It says don't eat of it while rare or raw. This is in the Korban Pesach and Mitzrayim. Would you say that doesn't apply in the future because it says of it? Amakras, it says vavata. No, it says you would do this service. Again, another time that all of the halachas that we mentioned that apply to the Korban Pesach and Mitzrayim apply here as well, besides for the one of purchasing it on the 10th. Vavata ella mimeno lamali. Why does it say that you will break sorry, why does it say that you will eat it? You're not allowed to eat it rare or raw. This is to teach you the idea of the Rabbi Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Like Rabbi said in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, because it says you will eat of it by the Korban Pesach, and it says you will eat of it by Meiser, by the tithe, just as by the tithe, which is also a form of the korban, that it has to be that someone who is uncircumcised may not eat of it. So too, the meiser, someone who is uncircumcised, may not eat of it. In any case, so we have like 10 things that says a limiting statement in regards to the Korban Pesach in it. And the Gemara asks, does that mean only in the Korban Pesach and Mitzrayim, or is it true for the future as well? The Gemara says it's true for the future as well. And in each one of them, there's a specific limit that the it tells you in this and not in something else. In a kosher korban, not in a pasul korban, in Korban Pesach, but not in teruma, in Korban Pesach, not in Meiser, etc. Now, there is the one limit in which it says you will speak to Bnei Yisrael, and on the 10th of this month, they will take for themselves the lamb on the 10th, and that one is a limit specifically to that idea, that mitzvah, that on the 10th you will purchase the Korban Pesach, the lamb for the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim, but in the future you can purchase it even on that very day, as long as it was checked for 4 days. The Mishnah said another distinction is that in Korban Pesach and Mitzrayim it had to be eaten quickly. Minola. How do we know that? The Amakra, it says, you will eat it quickly. Only this is eaten quickly, but no other Korban Pesach in the future has to be eaten quickly. The Mishnah also made a distinction of the difference between the Korban in Mitzrayim was only for that night, whereas in the future it was made for 7 days. Now the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Amaikai. What is this referring to? Ilema Pesach, is it talking about on the lamb itself, the Korban Pesach? Pesach, Kashiva Mi'ika? Is there a mitzvah of having a Korban Pesach for 7 days? That's not true. You only eat the Korban Pesach the first night of the Seder. So now we go to Tzadi Vav Amid Beis for the response. Ela Achametz. So it's talking about the chametz, that in Mitzrayim you only couldn't have chametz that night, whereas in the future you can't have chametz for 7 days. And Mechlal the Pesach Mitzrayim Laila Echad V'Sulay. So you're telling me that in Mitzrayim you only couldn't have Pesach, you couldn't have chametz that very day night, but you could have it the next morning. But we have a brisa that says not that way. Rabbi Yosef Glili, how do we know it was a full 1 day that you couldn't have chametz even the day during the day, not only the night of the Seder but the next morning as well. It says don't eat chametz today. You were going out, so that means that today, even during the day when you leave Mitzrayim, you cannot eat chametz. So this is the meaning of the Mishnah. Pesach is for 1 night. in general. Even in the future. However, the chimutzai, the chametz, is kalayim, is for one day. Pesach der is not shiva, but for the future, it is for 7 full days. For introduction to the next Mishnah, it is the concept of something we've seen many times. A carbon Pesach, when we're not bringing it for the Pesach itself, it becomes a shlom. That means if I dedicate a lamb for my carbon Pesach, and for whatever reason, I didn't end up bringing it, that carbon Pesach will now become automatically a lamb, a shlomim. Now we saw earlier, does it need akira? Do I need to uproot it and say it's a shlomim or not? The idea is that it reverts to being a shlomim, a lamb, which is in the shlomim, a peace offering, which this carbon Pesach is really in that general category in any case. Now, this is true in regards to a carbon Pesach that is Moiser Pesach, or leftover carbon Pesach. That means I brought a lamb. I dedicated a lamb for my carbon Pesach, and then it got lost. So I'm looking for it. I can't find it. There's lots of lambs in Yerushalayim on that day, as you can imagine. So I go in and purchase another one, and I bring my carbon Pesach, and then we find the one that said Fisher's carbon Pesach on it. So now I already brought my carbon Pesach, so I have this lamb. It becomes a shlam. This is called Mosar Pesach, leftovers. It can be after I brought my carbon Pesach. It could be really we found it before I bought the carbon Pesach, and we'll talk about whether that's valid or not. Or I can find it a week later. Either way, that's called a Mosar Pesach, a leftover Pesach. Another way of having a Mosar Pesach is not where I lost it and I dedicated another one, brought it, and then I found the first one. It could also be where I made a Tamura. Tamura is a prohibited thing. You're not allowed to swap out a carbon. So if I have a lamb here, I say, you know what? I don't want this one. I'm going to swap it out, and I bring another one next to it. I say, this carbon Pesach is transferred to this lamb. Actually, they are now both, I'm not allowed to do that, and they're both Kodesh. I now have 2 lambs. So I'm going to bring one, but the other one is going to be an extra carbon Pesach. So that's going to be brought as a shalom. So that it's called Mosar HaPesach, a leftover Pesach, or Temuras Pesach, a swap of a carbon Pesach. Amar Rabbi Yeshua. So the Mishnah says, Rabbi Yeshua said, Shamati Temuras Pesach Kreva. I learned from my teachers that there's a scenario where the swap of a carbon Pesach can be brought, is a valid carbon. Utmuras Pesach ain't a kreva. And I also learned that there's a scenario where the swap of the carbon Pesach is not a valid carbon. Ve'enli lefarish, but I can't remember the explanation what scenarios these are. Amar Rabbi Akiva, so Rabbi Yeshua's student Rabbi Akiva said, Ani afarish. I think I can explain this. If you find the leftover Pesach, whether it's the swap or not, so first, just the Pesach itself. I dedicated a carbon Pesach, and I put on a little tag on it, and it says Tzvi Fischer's carbon Pesach. It's the time to bring the carbon Pesach, and I can't find it. It escaped somewhere. So I go ahead and I purchase another one. And before I shecht the new one, I find the old one. So now I'm going to bring the new one that I dedicated, but the old one, which is dedicated as a carbon Pesach, is now actively going to be excluded. I'm invalidating it or pushing it aside because I'm bringing the new one. So there, you're actually staying. I can't actually bring this lamb as a shalomim, as a peace offering, which normally your leftover Pesach can be brought. And the reason is because I've actively set it aside. I've actively pushed it away. So once it's been invalidated actively by bringing the other one as the carbon Pesach, so now this has to go into pasture until it gets a blemish. Once it gets a blemish, you sell it and use the funds to buy a shlomim. However, and then also if I had that lamb and I say, no, I don't want to, this is a good lamb, I don't want to put it out into pasture to get a blemish. So I'm going to swap it onto another. Well, that swap is coming from an invalid korban right now. So the swap also is going to have this halacha that temuras Pesach, the swap of the Pesach also has to be sent into pasture, and the funds would be used as a shlamim, but I can't bring the lamb itself as a shlamim. However, if I find my original lamb after I've already dedicated after I already shechted my korban Pesach, that means I lost my first lamb. Then I go ahead and I dedicate another one, and I actually shecht it. I bring it as a korban Pesach, and then we find the original that day or the next day, whenever it is. So at this point, it was never invalidated as a Pesach. It was simply lost. When I find it, it's a valid Pesach, leftover Pesach. I can bring the lamb itself as a korban Pesach, as a shlamim. And since I can bring the lamb as a shlamim, if I swap it, I put it onto something else, the swap also is coming from the power of a valid shlamim. I can bring it as well as a shlamim. So Rabbi Yeshua, you said you heard that there's a swap of a Pesach that can be brought as a valid korban. That's this case where it was found after the replacement was shechted already. And with what you learned from your teachers that a swap of a Pesach cannot be brought, that's where it was found before the shechting. So the Gemara says, okay, so then why did the teachers teach this about the swap? This is true about the Pesach itself. The Pesach, if you find the original Pesach prior to the shechting, it's going to be a kosher Pesach. It's not going to be a kosher Pesach because you're essentially pushing it aside, and therefore it cannot be brought as a shlamim. And if you find the lost lamb after you already shechted the new Pesach, so then it was never set aside by actively pushed away, and so therefore you can bring it as a shlamim. V'lema Pesach Karev. Why don't we say it about itself? Hakamashma. We want to teach this idea. The ikat muras haPesach the lekareva. That there's a time that you swap a Pesach into another lamb, and it's not a valid korban. Itma Rabba Amar, Rabba said, Kodim shchita lacha shchita shenit. This that we mentioned in our Mishnah, if you found it before shechting it, so then you're actively pushing it away and it's not valid, it has to go into pasture. If you find it after shechting it, then you didn't push it aside, and so it's still a valid shlamim. That's talking about the actual shechting. However, Rabbi Zera Kodim chatzais lacha chatzais. It doesn't mean the actual shechting, it means prior to midday where you're allowed to begin shechting. So it's the time of the shechting. And what Rabbi Zera is saying is that once the new lamb has been dedicated, because you lost your old one, you found a new, you dedicated a new one, and even though you never shechted it yet, because you're, let's say, only going to get your turn at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but nevertheless, it's already the time for a korban Pesach because it's at midday. So now that locks in this lamb as your korban. So the new one, the old one that you lost, even though you found it now before you shechted the new one, but you found it after it's already been the time for shechting it, so that's been automatically invalidated and as a leftover for shlamim, and you can bring it as a and you can bring it directly as a shlamim. He says, but our Mishnah says before the shechting. Maybe it means before the time of the shechting. As we have a machlekes tanaim, Pesach shenimtza kedem shchita. If you find the korban Pesach before shechting yira, then it goes into pasture. Shchita. If you find it after the shechting yikarev, then you're allowed to bring it. However, that if you find it before the noon, then it goes into pasture. If you find it after noon, then it can be brought as a korban. Okay, wishing you a great day, meaningful fast if you are able to fast today, and